Hello, everyone. We are live. So recline, lay back, do whatever it is you do to get comfortable. And we will begin on chapter 8 of The Law and the Promise by Neville Goddard. I'm just going to wait for a few moments to give people an opportunity to come into the space so that they um, can catch it from the beginning. Let's see. I'm just waiting for a few more moments. I trust everyone had a good day. Hmm? I had a good day. Was it productive? Yes. Your work, right? And it was good. It was very good. There's one person here on YouTube. And I'm going to flip over now to chapter 8. I just want to wait for one more moment. Shea Butter, it's good to see you. I just want to wait for another couple moments so that, people catch it, the beginning. All right, I'm going to flip over here. Chapter 8 of The Law and the Promise, Through the Looking Glass. A man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleaseth, through it pass, and then the heaven espy. Ooh, George Herbert. Lovely poetry. Objects to be perceived must first penetrate in some manner our brain, but we are not, because of this, interlocked with our environment. Although normal consciousness is focused on the senses and is usually restricted to them, it is possible for man to pass through his sense fixation into an imaginal structure which he conceives and so fully occupy it that it is more alive and more responsive than that on which his senses or stay his eye. If this were not true, man would be an automaton reflecting life, never affecting it. Man, who is all imagination, is not tenant to the brain, but landlord. He need not rest content with the appearance of things. He can go beyond perceptual to conceptual awareness. This ability to pass through the mechanical reflective structure of the senses is the most important discovery man can make. It reveals man as a center of imagining with powers of intervention which enable him to alter the course of observed events, moving from success to success through a series of mental transformations in himself. Attention, the spearhead of imagining, may be either attracted from without as his senses or stay his eye, or directed from within if he pleases, and through the senses pass into the wish fulfilled. To move from perceptual awareness, or things as they seem, to conceptual awareness, or things as they ought to be, we imagine as vivid and as lifelike a representation as possible of what we would see, hear, and do were we physically present and physically experiencing things that they ought to be, and imaginatively participate in that scene. The following story tells of one who went through the glass and broke the chains that bound her. 2 years ago, I was taken to the hospital with a serious blood clot condition, which apparently had affected the entire vascular system, causing hardening of arteries and arthritis. A nerve in my head was damaged and my thyroid enlarged. Doctors could not agree on the cause of this condition, and all their treatments were completely ineffective. I was forced to give up my every enjoyable activity and remain in bed most of the time. My body, from hips to toes, felt as though it was encased and bound by tight wires, and I couldn't put my feet on the floor without wearing heavy hip-length elastic stockings. I knew something of your teaching and tried very hard to apply what I had heard, but as my condition grew worse and I could no longer attend any of your lectures, my despondency grew deeper. One day, a friend sent me a postcard picturing the scene of a lovely beach by the ocean. Oh, the picture was so beautiful, I looked and looked at it and began to remember past summer days at the seashore with my parents. For a moment, the postcard picture seemed to become animated, and flooding memories of myself running free on the beach filled my mind. I felt the impact of my bare feet against the hard, wet sand. I felt the icy water running over my toes and heard the crash of waves breaking on shore. This imaginal activity was so satisfying to me as I lay in bed that I continued to imagine this wonderful scene day after day for about 1 week. One morning, I moved from my bed to a couch and had started to sit up when I was seized with such an excruciating pain, my entire body became paralyzed. I could neither sit up nor lie down. This terrible pain lasted for more than a full minute, but when it stopped, I was free. It seemed as if all the wires binding my legs had been cut. One moment I was bound, the next moment I was free. Not by degrees, but instantly. VH. We walk by faith, not by sight. 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7. When we walk by sight, we know our way by objects which our eyes see. When we walk by faith, we order our life by scenes and actions which only imagination sees. Man perceives by the eye of imagination or by sense, but two mental attitudes to perception are possible: the creative imaginative effort, which meets with an imaginative response, or the unimaginative staying of the eye, which merely reflects. Man has within him the principle of life and the principle of death. One is the imagination building its imaginal structures out of the generous dreams of fancy. The other is the imagination building its imaginal structures from images reflected by the chill wind of fact. One creates, the other perpetuates. Man must adopt either the way of faith or the way of sight. To the extent that man builds from dreams of fancy, he is alive, and therefore the development of the faculty to pass through the reflective glass of the senses is an increase of life. It follows that restricting the imagination by staying the eye on the reflective glass of the senses is a reduction of life. The specious surface of fact reflects rather than discloses, deflecting the eye of imagination from the truth that sets man free. The eye of imagination, if not deflected, looks on what ought to be there, not what is. However familiar the scene on which sight rests, the eye of imagination could gaze on one never before witnessed. It is this eye of imagination, and only this, that can free us from the sense fixation of outer things, which completely dominates our ordinary existence and keeps us looking on the reflective glass of facts. It is possible to pass from thinking of to thinking from, but the crucial matter is thinking from, i.e., experiencing the state, for that experience means unification. Whereas in thinking of, there is always subject and object, the thinking individual and the thing thought of. Self abandonment. This is the secret. We have to abandon ourselves to the state in our love for the state, and in so doing, live the life of the state and no more our present state. Imagination seizes upon the life of the state and gives itself to the expression of the life of that state. Faith plus love is self-commission. We can't commit ourselves to what we do not love. Never would you have made anything if you had not loved it. And to make the state alive, one must become it. I live yet not I. God lives in me. I'll say it again. I live, yet not I. God lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by the faith of God who loved me and gave himself for me. God loved man, his created, and became man in faith that his act of self-commission would transform the created into the creative. We must be imitators of God as dear children and commit ourselves to what we love, as God who loved us committed himself to us. We must be the state to experience the state. The center of conscious imagining can be shifted, and what are now mere wishes, imaginal activities keyed low, brought into penetrative focus and entered. Entrance commits us to the state. The possibilities of such shifting of the center of imagining are startling. The activities concerned are physical throughout. The shifting of the center of imagining is not brought about by spatial travel, but by a change in what we are aware of. The boundary of the world of sense is a subjective barrier. So long as the senses take notice, the eye of imagination is deflected from the truth. So long as the senses take notice, the eye of imagination is deflected from the truth. We do not get far unless we let go. This lady let go with immediate and miraculous results. Thank you for the golden key. It has released my brother from the hospital from pain and probable death, for he was facing a fourth major operation with little hope of recovery. I was very concerned and attempting to use what I had learned about my imagination. I first asked myself what my brother truly desired. Does he want to continue in this body, or does he desire to be free of it? The question resolved itself over and over in my mind, and suddenly I felt that he would like to continue remodeling his kitchen, which he had been contemplating before his confinement in the hospital. I knew my question had been answered, so I began to imagine from that point. Attempting to see my brother in the busy activity of remodeling, I suddenly found myself gripping the back of a kitchen chair I had used many times when something happened. Then suddenly I found myself standing beside my brother's bed in the hospital. This was the last place I would have wanted to be, physically or mentally, but there I was, and my brother's hand reached up and clasped my hand tightly as I heard him say, "I knew you would come, Joe." It was a well hand I clasped, strong and sure, and the joy that filled and spilled over in my voice as I heard myself say, "It's all better now. You know it." My brother didn't answer, but I distinctly heard a voice say to me, "Remember this moment." I seemed to awake then, back in my own home. This took place the night after he had entered the hospital. The following day, his wife telephoned me saying, "It's unbelievable. The doctor cannot account for it, Joe, but no operation is necessary. He's so improved that they have agreed to release him tomorrow." The following Monday, my brother went back to his work and has been perfectly well since that day. J.S. Not facts, but dreams of fancy shape our lives. She needed no compass to find her brother, nor tools to operate. only the eye of imagination. In the world of sense, we see what we have to see. In the world of imagination, we see what we want to see. And seeing it, we create it for the world of sense to see. We see the outer world automatically. Seeing what we want to see demands voluntary and conscious imaginative effort. Our future is our own imaginal activity in its creative march. Common sense assures us that we are living in a solid and sensible world, but this so seemingly solid world is, in reality, imaginal through and through. The following story proves that it is possible for an individual to transfer the center of imagining to some greater or lesser degree to a distant area, and not only do so without moving physically, but to be visible to others who are present at that point in space-time. And if this be a dream, then is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream? Seated in my living room in San Francisco, I imagined I was in my daughter's living room in London, England. I surrounded myself so completely with that room, which I knew intimately, that I suddenly found myself actually standing in it. My daughter was standing by her fireplace, her face turned away from me. A moment later, she turned and our eyes met. I saw a startled, frightened expression on her face. That I, too, became emotionally upset and immediately found myself back in my own living room in San Francisco. 5 days later, I received an airmail letter from my daughter, which had been written on the day of my experiment with imaginal travel. In her letter, she told me she had seen me in her living room that day, just as real as though I were actually standing there in the flesh. She confessed she had been very frightened, and that before she could speak, I had vanished. The time of this visitation, as she gave it in her letter, was exactly the time I had begun the imaginative action, allowing, of course, for the difference in time between the 2 points. She explained that she told her husband of this amazing experience, and he insisted that she write to me immediately, as he stated. Your mother must have died or is dying. But I wasn't dead or dying, but very much alive and very excited by this marvelous experience. MLJ. Nothing can act but where it is. With all my heart, only where is it? Thomas Carlyle. Man is all imagination. Therefore, a man must be where he is in imagination, for his imagination is himself. Imagination is active at and through any state that it is aware of. If we take shifting of awareness seriously, there are possibilities beyond belief. The senses join man in forced and unholy wedlock to where he imaginatively awake, he would put asunder. We need not feed on sense data. Shift the focus of awareness and see what happens. However little we move mentally, we should perceive the world under a slightly changed aspect. Awareness is usually moved about in space by movement of the physical organism, but it need not be so restricted. It can be moved by a change in what we are aware of. Man is manifesting the power of imagination, whose limits he cannot define. To realize that the real self, imagination, is not something enclosed within the spatial boundary of the body is most important. The foregoing story proves that when we meet a person in the flesh, that his real self need not be present in space where his body is. It also shows that sense perception can be thrown into operation outside of the normal physical means, and that the sense data produced is of the same kind as those which occur in normal perception. The idea in the mother's mind, which started the whole process going, was the very definite idea of being in the place where her daughter lived. And if the mother really were in that place, and if the daughter were present, then she would have to be perceptible to the daughter. We can only hope to understand this experience is we can only hope to understand this experience in imaginal and not in mechanical or materialistic terms. The mother imagined elsewhere as being here. London was just as here to her daughter living there as San Francisco was here to the mother living there. It hardly ever crosses our minds that this world might be different in essence from what common sense tells us, so obviously it is. Blake writes, I question not my corporeal or vegetative eye any more than I would question a window concerning a sight. I look through it and not with it. This looking through the eye not only shifts consciousness to other parts of this world, but to other worlds as well. Astronomers must wish they knew more of this looking through the eye, this mental traveling that mystics practice so easily. I traveled through a land of men and women too, and heard and saw such dreadful things as cold earth wanderers never knew. Mental traveling has been practiced by awakened men and women since the earliest days. Paul states, I know a man in Christ who 14 years ago was caught up in the third heaven. Whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. God knows. 2 Corinthians 12. Paul is telling us that he is that man and that he traveled by the power of imagination or Christ. In his next letter to the Corinthians, he writes, Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Jesus Christ is in you now? We need not be dead in order to enjoy spiritual privileges. Man is all imagination, and God is man. Test yourselves as this mother did. Sir Arthur Eddington said that all we have a right to say of the external world is that it is a shared experience. Things are more or less real according to the extent to which they are capable of being shared with others or with ourselves at another time. But there is no hard and fast line. Accepting Eddington's definition of reality as shared experience, the above story is as real as the earth or a color for it was shared by both mother and daughter. The range of imagining is such that I must confess that I do not know what limits, if any, there are to its ability to create reality. All these stories show us one thing, that an imaginal activity implying the wish fulfilled must start in the imagination apart from the evidence of the senses in that journey that leads to the realization of desire. Chapter 9. Enter into. If the spectator would enter into these images in his imagination, approaching them on the fiery chariot of his contemplative thought, if he could, make a friend and companion of one of these images of wonder, which always entreats him to leave mortal things, as he must know, then would he arise from his grave, then would he meet the Lord in the air, and then he would be happy. William Blake. Imagination, it seems, will do nothing that we wish until we enter into the image of the wish fulfilled. Does not this entering into the image of the wish fulfilled resemble Blake's void outside of existence, which, if entered into, englobes itself and becomes a womb? Is this not the true interpretation of the mythical story of Adam and Eve? Man and his emanation. Are not man's dreams of fancy his emanation? His Eve in whom he plants himself in all her nerves, just as a husbandman his mold, and she becomes his dwelling place and garden, fruitful 70-fold. The secret of creation is the secret of imagining. First, desiring, and then assuming the feeling of the wish fulfilled until the dream of fancy, the void outside of existence, is entered and englobes itself and becomes a womb, a dwelling place and garden fruitful 70-fold. Note well that Blake urges us to enter into these images. This entering into the image makes it englobe itself and become a womb. Man, by entering a state, impregnates it and causes it to create what the union implies. Blake tells us that these images are shadowy to those who dwell not in them, mere possibilities. But to those who enter into them, they seem the only substances. On my way to the West Coast, I stopped in Chicago to spend the day with friends. My host was recovering from a severe illness, and his doctor advised him to move to a one-story house. Acting upon the doctor's advice, he had purchased a one-story house suited to his needs. But he now was confronted with the fact that there seemed to be no buyer for his large three-story home. When I arrived, he was very discouraged. In trying to explain the law of constructive imagining to my host and his wife, I told them the story of a very prominent New York woman who had come to see me concerning the rental of her apartment. She maintained a lovely city apartment and a country home, but it was absolutely essential that she rent her apartment if she and her family were to spend the summer at their country home. In previous years, the apartment had been rented without any difficulty early in the spring. But at the time she came to see me, the season for summer sublets was seemingly over. Although the apartment had been in the hands of good real estate agents, no one had seemed interested in renting it. I told her what to do in her imagination. She did it, and in less than 24 hours, her apartment was rented. I explained how she, by the constructive use of her imagination, had rented her apartment. At my suggestion, before she went to sleep that night in her apartment in the city, she imagined she was lying in her bed in her country home. In her imagination, she viewed the world from the country house rather than from the city apartment. She smelled the fresh country air. She made this so real that she actually drifted off to sleep feeling that she was in the country. That was on a Thursday night. At 9 o'clock the following Saturday morning, she phoned me from her country home and told me that on Friday, a highly desirable tenant who met all of her requirements not only rented her apartment, but rented it on the one condition that he could move in that very day. I suggested to my friends that they build an imaginal structure as this woman had done, and that was to sleep, imagining they were physically present in their new home, feeling they had sold their old home. I explained to them the wide difference between thinking of the image of their new house and thinking from the image of their new house. Thinking of it is a confession they are not in it. Thinking from it is proof that they are in it. Entering into the image would give substance to the image. Their physical occupancy of the new house would follow automatically. I explained that what the world looks like depends entirely on where man is when he makes his observation, and man, being all imagination, must be where he is in imagination. This concept of causation disturbed them, for it smacked of magic or superstition, but they promised they would try it. I left that night for California, and the following evening the conductor on the train in which I was traveling handed me a telegram. It read, "House sold midnight last." 1 week later, they wrote and told me that the very night I left Chicago, they fell asleep physically in the old house, but mentally in the new, viewing the world from the new home, imagining how things would sound if this were true. They were awakened that very night from their sleep to be told the house was sold. Not until the image is entered, until Eve is known, does the event burst upon the world. The wish fulfilled must be conceived in the imagination of man before the event can evolve out of what Blake calls the void. This next story proves that by shifting the focus of her imagining, Mrs. A.F. entered physically into where she had persisted in being imaginatively. Soon after our marriage, my husband and I decided that our greatest joint desire was a year in Europe. The objective may seem reasonable to a lot of people, but to us, tied to a narrow sphere of limited finances, it seemed not only unreasonable, but completely ridiculous. Europe might as well have been another planet. But I had heard your teaching, so I persisted in falling asleep in England. Why England necessarily? I cannot tell, except that I had seen a current motion picture featuring the area around Buckingham Palace and had promptly fallen in love with the scene. All I did in my imagination was to stand quietly outside the great iron gates and feel the cold metal bars gripped tightly in my hands as I viewed the palace. For many, many nights, I felt an intense joy at being there and fell asleep in that happy state. Soon after, my husband met a stranger at a party who, within 1 month, was instrumental in securing a teaching fellowship for him at a great university. Imagine my excitement when I heard the university was in England. Tied to a narrow sphere? Within another month, we were crossing the Atlantic, and our supposedly insurmountable difficulties melted as though they never existed. We had our year in Europe, one of the happiest years of my life. MF. What the world looks like depends entirely on where man is when he makes his observations. And man, being all imagination, must be where he is in imagination. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. That stone is imagining. I acquaint you with this secret and leave you to act or react. This is the famous stone that turneth all to gold. For that which God doth touch and own cannot for less be told. George Herbert. My home is old, but it is mine. I wanted the exterior painted and the interior redecorated, yet I had no money to accomplish either objective. You told us to live as though our desire is already a reality, and this I began to do. Imagining my old house with a brand new coat of paint, new furnishings, new decoration, and all the trimmings. I walked in my imagination through the newly decorated rooms. I walked around the outside admiring the fresh paint, and at the end of my imaginal act, I handed the contractor a check for payment in full. I entered this imaginal scene faithfully, as often as I could during the day and each night before I fell asleep. Within 2 weeks, I received a registered letter from Lloyd's of London, telling me I had inherited $7,000 from a woman I had never met. I had known her brother slightly almost 40 years before and had performed a small service 15 years ago for the lady when his brother had died in our country, and she had written me asking for particulars regarding his death, which I was able to provide. I had not heard from her since that time. Now here was the check for $7,000, more than enough to cover the cost of my house restoration, plus many, many other things I desired. ECA. He who does not imagine in stronger and better lineaments, and in stronger and better light than his perishing and mortal eye can see, does not imagine at all. Blake. Unless the individual imagines himself someone else or somewhere else, the present conditions and circumstances of his life will continue in being, and his problems recur, for all events renew themselves from his constant images. By him they were made, By him they continue in being, and by him they can cease to be. The secret of causation is in the assembled imagery, but a word of warning. The assemblage must have meaning. It must imply something, or it will not form the creative activity. The word. Chapter 10. Things which do not appear. What is seen was made out of things which do not appear. Hebrews 11:3. Human history, with its forms of government, its revolutions, its wars, and in fact the rise and fall of nations, could be written in terms of the rise and fall of ideas implanted in the minds of men. Herbert Hoover. The secret of imagining is the greatest of all problems, to the solution of which the mystic aspires. Supreme power, supreme wisdom, supreme delight. He in the far-off solution of this mystery. Douglas Fawcett. To refuse to recognize the creative power of man's invisible imaginal activity is too great to be argued with. Man, through his imaginal activity, literally calls into existence the things that do not exist. By man's imaginal activity, all things are made, and without such activity was not anything made that was made. Such causal activity could be defined as an imaginal assemblage of images, which occurring, some physical event invariably takes place. It is for us to assemble the images of happy outcome and then keep from interfering. The event must not be forced, but allowed to happen. If imagination is the only thing that acts or is in existing beings or men, as Blake believed, then we should never be certain that it was not some woman treading in the winepress who began that subtle change in men's minds. This grandmother is daily treading the winepress for her little granddaughter. She writes. This is one of those things that make my family and friends say, we just don't understand it. Kim is 2.5 years old now. I took care of her for a month after she was born and did not see her again until a year ago, and then only for 2 weeks. However, during this past year every day, I have taken her on my lap in my imagination and cuddled her and talked to her. In these imaginal acts, I go over all the wonderful things about Kim. God is growing through me. God is loving through me, etc. At first, I would get the response of a very young child. When I started God is growing through me, she would reply, me? Now, as I start, she completes the whole sentence. Another thing that has happened is, as the months have passed, as I take her, in my imagination, on my lap, she has grown constantly larger and heavier. Kim hasn't even seen a picture of me in the past year. At the most, I could only be a name to her. Now, sometime each day, her family tells me she starts talking about me. To no one in particular, just talking. Sometimes it goes on for an hour, or she goes to the phone and pretends to call. In her monologue are such bits as, my Dee Dee loves me. My Dee Dee always comes to see me every day. Even though I know what I have been doing in my imagination, it has caused me to wonder much. UK. All imaginative men and women are forever casting forth enchantments, and all passive men and women who have no powerful imaginative lives are continually passing under the spell of their power. There is no form in nature which is not produced by and sustained by some imaginal activity. Therefore, any change in the imaginal activity must result in a corresponding change in form. To imagine a substitute image for unwanted or defective content is to create it. If only we persist in our ideal imaginal activity and do not let lesser satisfactions suffice, ours shall be victory. When I read in Seed Time and Harvest the story of the school teacher who, through her imagination in daily revision, transformed a delinquent pupil into a lovely girl, I decided to do something about a young boy in my husband's school. To tell all the problems involved would take pages, for my husband has never had such a difficult child, nor such a trying parent situation. The lad was too young to be expelled, yet the teachers refused to have him in their classes. To make matters worse, the mother and grandmother literally camped on the school grounds, making trouble for everyone. I wanted to help the boy, but I also wanted to help my husband. So nightly, I constructed two scenes in my imagination. One, I saw a perfectly normal, happy child. Two, I heard my husband say, I can't believe it, dear, but do you know R? He's acting like a normal boy now, and it is heaven not having those two women around. After 2 months of persisting in my imaginal play, night after night, my husband came home and said, It's like heaven around school. Not exactly the same words, but close enough for me. The grandmother had become involved in something that took her out of town, and the mother had to accompany her. At the same time, a new teacher had welcomed the challenge of R, and he was progressing wonderfully well into all I imagined for him, GB. It is useless to hold standards that we do not apply. Unlike Portia, who said, I can easier teach 20 what were good to be done than be one of the 20 to follow mine own teaching. GB followed her own teaching. It is fatally easy to make the acceptance of the imaginal faith a substitute for living by it. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound. Isaiah 61:1. We will close now with chapter 11. The Potter. Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will let you hear my words. So I went down to the potter's house, and there he was working at his wheel. And the vessel he was making of clay was spoiled in the potter's hands, and he reworked it into another vessel, as it seemed good to the potter to do. Jeremiah 18:2-4. The word translated potter means imagination. Out of material others would have thrown away as useless, an awakened imagination refashions it as it ought to be. O Lord, thou art our Father. We are the clay, and thou art our potter. We are all the work of thy hand. Isaiah 64:8. This conception of creation as a work of imagination, and the Lord our Father as our imagination, will take us further into the mystery of creation than any other guide. The only reason people do not believe in this identity of God and human imagination is that they are unwilling to assume the responsibility for their frightful misuse of imagination. Divine imagination has descended to the level of human imagination, that human imagination may ascend to divine imagination. The 8th Psalm says that man was made a little lower than God, not a little lower than the angels, as the King James Version mistakenly translates it. Angels are the emotional dispositions of man, and therefore his servant and not his superior, as the author of Hebrews tells us. Hebrews 1:14. Imagination is the real man and is one with God. Imagination creates, conserves, and transforms. Imagination is radically creative when all imaginative activity based on memory disappears. Imagination is radically creative when all imaginative activity based on memory disappears. Imagination is conservative when its imaginal activity is fed with images supplied mainly by memory. Imagination is transformative when it varies a theme already in being, when it mentally alters a fact of life, when it leaves the fact out of the remembered experience or puts something in its place if it upsets the harmony of desires. Through the use of her imagination, this talented young artist had made her dream a reality. Ever since I entered into the art field, I have enjoyed doing sketches and paintings for children's rooms. However, I have been discouraged by advisors and friends who were far more experienced in the field than I. They liked my work, admired my talent, but said I would not get recognition nor pay for this type of work. Somehow I always felt I would. But how? Then last fall I heard your lectures and read your books, and I decided to let my imagination create the reality I desired. This is what I did daily. I imagined I was in a gallery. There was a great deal of excitement about me. On the walls hung my art, only mine, a one-woman show. And I saw red stars on many of the pictures. This would indicate that they had been sold. This is what happened. Just before Christmas, I did a mobile for a friend who showed it in turn to a friend of hers who owns an art import shop in Pasadena. He expressed a desire to meet me. So I took a few samples of my work along. When he looked at the very first painting, he said he would like to give me a one-woman show in the spring. The night of the opening, April 17th, an interior decorator came and liked and commissioned me to do a collage for a little boy's room, which will appear in the September issue of Good Housekeeping for the 1961 House of the Year. Later, during the showing, another decorator came and admired my work so much. He asked if he might arrange for me to meet the right interior decorators and the right owners of galleries who would buy and display my work properly. Incidentally, the show was a financial success for the owner of the gallery as well as for me. The interesting thing about this is that seemingly these three men came to me out of the blue. Well, certainly I made no effort during the time of my imagining to contact anyone, but now I am getting recognition and have a market for my work. And now I know without a shadow of a doubt that there is no when you seriously apply this principle that imagining creates reality. GL. She tested the potter and proved his creativity in performance. Only the indolent mind would fail to rise to this challenge, indolent meaning lazy. Paul states, the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now examine yourselves to see whether you are holding to your faith. Test yourselves. Do you not realize that Jesus Christ is in you? Unless indeed you fail to meet the test. I hope you will find out that we have not failed. 2 Corinthians 13:5 and 6. If all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made, it should not be difficult for man to test himself to find out who this creator in himself is. The test will prove to man that his imagination is the one who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Romans 4:17. The potter's presence in us is inferred from what he does there. We cannot see him there as one not ourselves. The nature of the potter, Jesus Christ, is to create, and there is no creation without him. Every recorded story in this book is just such a test as Paul asked the Corinthians to make. God really and truly exists in man, in every human being. God wholly becomes us. He is not our virtue, but our real selves, our imagination. The following illustrations from the mineral world may help us to see how supreme imagining and human imagining could be one and the same power and yet be vastly different in their creativity. Diamond is the world's hardest mineral. Graphite, used in lead pencils, is one of the softest. Yet both minerals are pure carbon. The vast difference in the properties of the two forms of carbon is believed to be caused by a different arrangement of the carbon atoms. But whether the difference is produced by a different arrangement of the carbon atoms or not, all agree that diamond and graphite are one substance, pure carbon. The purpose of life is the creative realization of desire. Man, lacking desire, could not exist efficiently in a world of continuous problems requiring continuous solutions. A desire is an awareness of something we lack or need to make life more enjoyable. Desires always have some personal gain in view. The greater the anticipated gain, the more intense the desire. There's no really unselfish desire. Even when our desire is for another, we are still seeking to gratify desire. To attain our desire, we should imagine scenes implying their fulfillment and enact the scene in our imagination. If only momentarily, with a joy sufficiently felt within its limits to make it natural. It is like a child dressing up and playing queen. We must imagine we are what we would like to be. We must play it in imagination first, not as a spectator, as an actor. This lady imaginatively played queen by being where she wanted to be in her imagination. She was the true actor in this theater. My desire was to attend a matinee performance of a famous pantomimist currently playing in one of the largest theaters in our city. Because of the intimate nature of his art, I wanted to sit in the orchestra, but I didn't have enough the price of a balcony ticket. The night I determined to have this pleasure for myself in my imagination, I fell asleep watching the wondrous performer. In my imaginal act, I sat in an orchestra, center seat, heard the applause as the curtain rose and the artist came on stage, and I actually felt the intense excitement of this experience. The next day, the day of the matinee performance, my financial condition had not changed. I had exactly $1.37 in my purse. I knew I must use the dollar to buy gas for my car, which would leave me with 37 cents. But I also knew I had faithfully slept in the feeling of being at that performance. So I dressed myself for the theater. While changing articles from one purse to another, I found a dollar bill and 45 cents in change hidden in the pocket of my seldom used opera purse. I grinned to myself, realizing that gasoline money had been given to me. So would the balance of my theater ticket be given to me. Well, gaily I finished dressing and left for the theater. Standing before the ticket window, my confidence dwindled as I gazed at the prices and saw $3.75 for orchestra seats. With a feeling of dismay, I turned away quickly and walked across the street to a cafe for a cup of tea. I had spent 16 cents on my tea before I remembered seeing the price of balcony seats on the ticket window list. Hurriedly, I counted my change and found I had $1.60 left. Running back to the theater, I bought the cheapest seat available, which cost $1.55. With one dime left in my purse, I went to the entrance, and the usher tore my ticket in half, saying, "Upstairs left, please." The performance was about to begin. But ignoring the usher's instructions, I walked into the main floor ladies' restroom, still determined to sit in the orchestra section. I sat down, closed my eyes, and kept my inward sight riveted on the stage from the direction of the orchestra. At that moment, a group of women walked into the restroom, all talking at once, but I heard only one conversation, as a woman speaking to her companion said, "But I waited and waited until the last moment. Then she called and said she couldn't make it. I would have given her ticket away, but it was too late now." Not realizing it, I handed the usher both tickets and he tore them in half before I could stop him. I almost laughed aloud. Getting up, I walked over to this lady and asked if I might use the extra ticket she had instead of the balcony seat I had bought. She was charming and kindly invited me to join her party. The ticket she handed me was for the orchestra section, center seat, 6 rows from the stage. I sat in that seat only moments before the curtain rose on a performance I had witnessed the night before from that seat in my imagination. J.R. We must actually be in imagination. It is one thing to think of the end, and another thing to think from the end. To think from the end, to enact the end, is to create reality. The inner actions must correspond to the actions we would physically perform after these things should be. To live wisely, we must be aware of our imaginal activity and see to it that it is faithfully shaping the end we desire. The world is clay. Our imagination is the potter. We should always imagine ends that are of value or promise well. He who desires but act not, let me read it again. He who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. He who desires but acts not breeds pestilence. What's done flows from what's imagined. Outward forms reveal the imaginings of man. Man is the shuttle to whose winding quest and passage through these looms God ordered motion, but ordained no rest. This story. I run a small business, solely owned. And a few years ago, it seemed that my venture would end in failure. For some months, sales had fallen steadily, and I found myself in a financial jam, along with thousands of other small businessmen, as this period spanned one of our country's minor recessions. I was badly in debt and needed at least $3,000 almost immediately. My auditors advised me to close my doors and try to salvage what I could. Instead, I turned to my imagination. I knew your teaching, but had never actually attempted to solve any problem in this manner. Well, I was frankly skeptical of the entire idea that imagination can create reality. But I was also desperate. And desperation forced me to test your teaching. I imagined my office receiving $4,000 unexpectedly in remittance due. This money would have to come from new orders as my accounts receivables were practically non existent. But this seemed far fetched, as I hadn't received this much in sales during the last 4 months or more. Nevertheless, I kept my imaginal picture of receiving this amount of money steadily before me for 3 days. Early the fourth morning, a customer I had not heard from in months called me on the telephone, asking me to come and see him personally. I was to bring a quotation previously given him for machinery needed by his factory. The quotation was months old, but I dug it out of my files and lost no time in arriving at his office that day. I wrote out the order which he signed, but I saw no immediate help for me in the transaction, as the equipment he wanted would take from 4 to 6 months for factory delivery. And of course, my customer did not have to pay for it until delivered. I thanked him for the order and rose to leave. He stopped me at the door and handed me a check for a little over $4,000, saying, I want to pay for the merchandise now in advance, for tax purposes, you know. You don't mind? No, I didn't mind. I realized what had happened the moment I took that check into my hands. Within 3 days, my imaginal act had done for me what I hadn't been able to do in months of desperate financial shuffling. I know now that imagination could have brought $40,000 into my business just as easily as 4,000. LNC. O Lord, thou art our Father, we are the clay, and thou art our potter, we are all the work of thy hand. There concludes our reading for tonight. We will continue with chapter 12, Attitudes, tomorrow night. I trust you are as inspired to act as I am, and that you're wound up and ready to get it done. Even if you're unsure, what does he say? What did all of these people say? They imagined something. They felt something. Well, then practice that part. Remember what this man also said. Out of desperation, he tested. Imagination creates reality. So, my beautiful friends, I love you greatly. Rest well in the wish fulfilled. Rest well, my beautiful friends. Hey, Miss Deborah, Chris, Marquise, Flo Smiles. I see you all here. I see you. Alrighty, YouTube, fan base, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. I love you all. Good night.